Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to the Urban Design Group. This is my second time in front of the Urban Design Group. Last time I was talking about a slightly ridiculous idea to have a Thames Estuary airport, but that was a whole other event. As Ben said, I spend a lot of my time outside of the UK, working on city-related projects. I work on a lot of projects which are really about constructing and developing new cities of very, very large development schemes, which have housing as a very important element. And I also work on a lot of projects which have gone quite badly wrong in countries where they have the luxury of throwing a lot of money at big development projects in the hope of creating new places and housing a lot of people. And sometimes the fundamentals are just completely flawed. And as Ben said in his opening remarks, it's a very, very difficult task to take on, to create a new settlement from scratch very quickly that actually has meaning and resonance and is able to live a long life. And I want to try and bring some of that experience to bear in the next few minutes. Ben, you have to tell me if I talk too long. Okay, tell me to shut up. Okay. So Ben asked me to talk about the business case for garden cities. Is there a business case for the garden city? I work on quite a lot of business cases, and they can be very quick, succinct little summaries of something, and they can be huge, complicated, convoluted things that don't really make sense. But the first thing to think about with the business case for anything is the perspective. Whose perspective are we talking about? Whose business case is this? Who's making the case from whom to whom? And there are two perspectives really to take into account. The first is the private perspective, the perspective of the developer or the funder or the private entity that is going to play a role. Someone's turned the volume up, I think. And the private component, the private partner in all of this, is of course looking for a return on their investment. They are looking at the internal rate of return, the private rate of return on the investment, and they want to know that the investment in the garden city is better than an alternative investment that they might make, either in a different kind of project or in a different place. So there's the private return on investment. But the problem with housing is that it's not really a purely private good. It has what we economists call public good characteristics. The consumption of housing, the fact that we are all sheltered in housing, or most of us are sheltered in housing, has a social impact, has a positive social impact. So there are public good components to the consumption of housing, which is quite often why the government will seek to intervene in that market. The market doesn't necessarily generate the quantum of housing that we need or house people in the right way. So there is always a balance to be struck between the private return and the public good, or the impact, the economic rate of return. We sometimes call this the return to government. And there's an interesting balance here between internal rate of return, private return and public return. And sometimes projects, very large scale projects, cannot generate a high enough internal rate of return to be attractive enough to a purely private investor or funder, which is why the government may need to intervene to encourage the private sector to develop. It leads to a fundamental question for me, which underpins a lot of the discussion about new settlements in general, large-scale development projects, and it's really the relationship between the government and the private sector here. One of the interesting characteristics about the United Kingdom now is we have, over the last 20 to 30 years, moved away from any desire to see government directly intervene in the supply of housing. And I think when it comes to new settlements, that presents us with some potential difficulties. They're not necessarily insurmountable, but there are some challenges there. So in terms of the business case for garden cities, there are some basic components of a business case that you might want to make, and I'll go through the various components. We need to first of all start off with the rationale. What is the rationale or the objective of this investment? Why would we do this? Why would we invest in a garden city or a new settlement of some kind? Secondly, what actually is it? What is the proposal? What is it that we're talking about when we say garden city? Is it the thing that Ebenezer Howard devised himself, or is it some evolved concept of the garden city? But what is it? The next aspect of the business case is how much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost us to do this project that we think has a rationale? Next, what is the return on that investment? What is the return on incurring that cost? And this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, because going back to public versus private impact, there is a benefit or return in terms of financial gain for a private investor, but there's also benefit in terms of socio-economic, social benefit, public good. And it's the balance between the cost of development, the cost of the project, and these different kinds of returns and benefits that will tell us whether we should do this thing or not. What's the balance between cost and benefit? And that balance has to be discounted over time. If it's a true business case and we're making a true financial decision, we need to discount those benefits over time, because the value of the benefit in the future is worth less to us today. It has to be discounted to make a proper judgment. And the final part of the business case is it actually deliverable? Can this concept be operationalized? Can it be delivered and organized? And how do we do that? How do we deliver and organise that thing? Is it something that is actually feasible? So let me just quickly go through the different aspects of the business case in the context of the Garden City. So first of all, the rationale. What's the purpose or the objective of proposing this Garden City development? Now, this is one of the fundamental challenges with any large-scale development project. If you get this bit wrong, then the rest of it is just going to be a big mess. And I have worked on cities which are highly problematic because they have not, new cities which have not been planned properly. The rationale was not really there at all. And governments spend a lot of money putting in a lot of infrastructure, very expensive infrastructure, into locations which should never really have been identified as new cities. The rationale wasn't there, wasn't really there. And also part of the rationale is, what problem or what need do we think this project is addressing? Are we clear about the need? Do we understand the need? Do we understand the problem? How do we specify this correctly? And in doing so, under what circumstances will this investment, this project, yield the level of return that we think it's capable of yielding? Will it only happen under certain circumstances, or is it a generic model that we can apply to many different contexts? So the rationale, what is the rationale for, what's the objective? We need to be very, very clear about that. What problem are we solving? Well, in the UK context, we think we know what the problem is, or we think we know what the challenges are. Firstly, Ben already mentioned this, we have historically, I would say, a rapidly increasing population in the United Kingdom. In the decade to 2013, our population increased by 7.6%, which doesn't sound like an awful lot, but for a settled, mature economy like the United Kingdom, that is a high rate of population growth. And our population will probably reach 70 million by 2027. When I was a schoolboy, not so long ago, we used to think the UK population was all kind of around about 50 million people. That was the number we always associated with the UK population, 50 million. Now we have to get used to 70 million. That's going to be the population of the United Kingdom. So that's quite a big leap in my relatively short lifetime. It gets more interesting than that, because it's not just increasing in size, it's kind of changing in terms of its characteristics and its dynamics. The population is simultaneously aging and getting younger. Now what I mean by that is, as the population grows over the next 20 years, it's going to start bulging at the top end. People aged over 60, we're all living longer because we're all healthier. But we also have a higher birth rate than we used to have. So the population is also getting younger at the bottom, so the bottom end starting to bulge out as well. So you're getting a lot of older people, a lot of younger people, very young people, people from age 0 upwards. And that's quite interesting, because these people at that end and that end, they need a lot of support. They need a lot of social infrastructure. They quite often need a lot of care. They need a lot of access to open space. They need a lot of access to amenities, to public services. The bit that's getting squeezed a little bit as we increase our population is our bit, the economically active bit, the people who are actively working and generating an income and generating an output for the economy. That bit's getting a little bit squeezed while we get bulges at either end. And that's something which is quite significant when we think about how we need to develop settlements and increase housing over time. The other interesting thing we need to think about in the context of how the population is changing is the role of technology, and how technology will change the way that we interact with the built environment and interact with housing. And what that seems to be doing, what technology seems to be doing, is increasing our desire as a society to cluster together. And certainly economic value in the United Kingdom seems to be generated more easily where there's a lot of coming together, clustering, physical clustering of knowledge and high-level inputs into different production and service processes. So it's not dissipating, it tends to be clustering. So a lot of interesting things going on with population, how we're going to interact with the environment. The other thing that we think is a big need, of course, is housing. We think one of our big problems is undersupply of housing. And the data suggests that we need 240,000 new houses every year. We're building, at the moment, around 50% of that, so we're underachieving. We're building about 30% of the level of housing that we were building immediately pre-recession in 2007. So we're not building enough houses, but that may be compounded by the possibility that not only are we not building enough, we may not be planning for enough housing. So even if we were building as much housing as is specified in all of the local plans, that may still not be enough for this rapidly increasing population. So undersupply of housing causes, of course, price increase. So we have a lot of affordability issues, and that's becoming quite a pressing policy issue, particularly here in London. It's becoming increasingly difficult to buy property, as we know. It's becoming even very difficult to rent property in London, and eventually that will start to impact negatively on London's competitiveness. And there are many other cities waiting to take our young creative people who cannot afford to live in London anymore. They'll all go to Berlin and do their tech startups in Berlin instead of London. So we've got population issues, we've got supply of housing issues. At the same time, the government is actually spending quite a lot of money on housing. It's spending about £25 billion. Yolanda will know this better than me. Maybe I've got this wrong. About £25 billion on housing, but it's tending to use that in terms of instruments on the demand side of housing. So it's things like the right to buy scheme, it's things like housing benefit. There are many good reasons, of course, why the government pays housing benefit, but these are things that stimulate demand or the desire to be in housing or the ability to own or rent property. So we have a constrained supply and measures which are stimulating demand, and of course that will increase prices, making the affordability issue more challenging, more pressing. So there is a problem we think we can solve possibly with a garden city type concept, which takes us to the next part of the business case, which is, okay, well, what is it? What is that thing, that garden city thing, that we think is going to solve or address these particular issues? And I think there are different ways of understanding. I'm an economist, so I don't know an awful lot about planning and architecture, so you'll have to excuse my ignorance. But it seems to me that this concept can take different forms. The original concept seems to be, to me, really a form of new settlement, a form of new town, a standalone settlement, a new place in its own right. It seems to me that is one of the... Oh, there's a lady shaking her head. I've got this wrong. So it seems to me that's one possible characterisation of the garden city, and the government's prospectus suggests that should have a minimum of 15,000 homes, which is maybe around 35,000 people. So it's kind of getting to a level where it might be a sustainable urban settlement. But in my experience of having worked on a lot of new towns and new cities and big urban extensions, the concept of the new settlement, the new place, is easily the most problematic thing to try and plan for, because it is not just a physical place with housing and infrastructure. It has to become an economy in its own right. It has to have a real economic base, because it has to employ people. Otherwise, it is really just a housing estate. And the challenge is trying to create that economy from scratch in a new place. It's extremely challenging. Many governments try to do it, and they fail to do it, and they spend a lot of money trying to undo it. There are alternative versions of that. It's the garden city. If we're talking about garden city, it could be somehow an evolution or an extension of an existing urban area, potentially. Ben mentioned the Wolfson Prize. I'm sure many of you in the room were involved in Wolfson Prize teams. I was, certainly. And that was quite an interesting outcome. The winning competition entry from URBED was essentially an idea about taking an existing urban centre and making it bigger. Successful urban centre, make it house and include more people, make it a bigger, better place than it already is. And that is quite an appealing idea to me, because you've got something that already has an economic function, has an economic rationale, there's a reason why it exists, it's got a historic reason for existing, and you try to make it accommodate more people. So you're building on something, it has an economic rationale for existing. The URBED Wolfson Prize winning proposal was that Oxford should double in size, which again is very appealing, I'm sure, if you don't live in Oxford, but anyway, that's a whole other consideration. But then, is that a garden city if you double Oxford? According to Garden City principles, is that Garden City? I don't know. There is a third alternative, which is even a little bit further removed from the kind of new settlement, and that's maybe just about taking our existing urban areas, and rather than making them bigger, is maybe possibly densifying what we already have, particularly around very large infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure. And that's quite interesting in the context of how the population is going to change. The fact that we're going to get the older cohort bulging out and the very young cohort bulging out, the need to be very close to each other and very close to amenities and transport and social infrastructure. Maybe this is also something to think about. So what is it that we're talking about in terms of a garden city? Maybe it is one or other, or a combination of these things. I think that's also something that needs to be defined. What is it that we're talking about? Because we need to make the business case for something. It needs to be a very tangible, definable proposal. So the next part of the business case, if we were to make a business case for the garden city concept, is the whole relationship between the cost of developing it and the return from the investment in that cost of developing it. And I think this is where it starts to raise very interesting questions about the relationship between the private sector, the private developer or the private funder, and the government, or an agency that acts on behalf of the government in seeking to balance the private good, the private return, with the public good. And a lot of questions come out of this, particularly around the infrastructure, the base, the physical platform for the new development, and who bears the cost of that infrastructure, who bears the cost of the infrastructure on the site, who bears the cost of the infrastructure to the site. Connecting settlements to existing networks is very, very expensive, and not 5 minutes, my goodness, okay, and not easy. And it's a question that it's an issue that quite often stops these projects moving forward in the way that maybe was initially envisaged. So there's some big questions to answer here, some big issues. Who is going to build? Who's going to construct? Is it a single developer? Is it a single funder? Quite often single developers don't build whole towns, don't build whole settlements. Sometimes they do. It looks like an Ebbsfleet. It might be a single developer doing it, but it's a very high risk strategy for a developer. It may be better to spread that risk across a number of developers, many different developers that can bring different types of product, housing product, to market. This is particularly interesting given the increasing incidence of the private rental sector is becoming more important now. It's a more important form of housing, particularly given we have more single-person households. But the question is, do we have enough small developers? Do we have this variation in different types of developers that can work together to help de-risk the project to bring forward sufficient housing? Then it gets really complicated, because we have all of these issues about how is the land acquired for this type of development? Who acquires the land? At what point do they acquire the land? What do they pay for this land? When do they pay for it? Before planning permission is granted, after planning permission? And this is fundamental, because one of the underlying principles of large-scale development is that the capture of the value from the uplift of the land, capturing that uplift value, is going to pay for the infrastructure, which will provide the platform for the development. So a lot of these questions are very, very important, and they're not easy to answer. It's fundamentally dependent on the type of settlement we think we're talking about, whether it's a completely new settlement or some kind of urban infill or some kind of densification. It's all very, very important, and it leads us to the big question for me, which is how is this going to be funded? All of this. Is this a privately funded thing? Is there sufficient return in the whole thing, return on investment for a private funder? Or does the government somehow have to play a role, even if it's de-risking the investment process? And I think the complicated thing is that all of these different projects, the Garden City type project, whatever it might be, they all have to be dealt with very much on a case-by-case basis, because they will all have different contexts and different locational factors. So there's some big questions that keep coming back. What is it that we're actually talking about? What is this Garden City concept? It needs to be defined. What's the role of the government? And a big question, where is it? Where are we going to do this? Because that will drive a lot of the considerations. Where are we doing it? Everywhere has a different context, a different potential form of development, and a different form of economic activity that might actually happen there. And it's difficult for me to see that in this kind of large-scale development that there won't be a role for government somehow, even if it is developing some kind of development corporation that undertakes some of these roles or de-risks the development, etc. I've only got 1 minute left. I'd just like to make a personal observation, if I may, about garden cities, which garden cities to me are new towns. To me, I equate them with new towns, and I grew up in a new town. I grew up in a town called Cumbernauld, which is very close to Glasgow. Those of you who are architecture students in the room may have studied Cumbernauld. It's a quite peculiar place, I have to say. It's funny, if you grew up in a new town, you think it's normal. You think all towns are like this. And then you go to other towns and you think, that is a weird place. That kind of turned out all right. And you think you just got high streets and historic centres. Good grief with all these things. Cumbernauld was interesting because, of course, it was it was a new town. It's close to Glasgow. It's one of its rationales was to remove the aspirant working class from all the awful things that are happening in Glasgow and put them in this beautiful green, slightly concrete setting of Cumbernauld, and that worked really well. It was a great place to grow up. When I was about 12, I thought it was really boring, but actually it was a great place to grow up. It was very green. It's more green space than you can shake a stick at. It was very, very green. And I'm sure we were all very healthy. We were healthy and more productive than we would otherwise have been. So it fulfilled a lot of the criteria, ticked a lot of the boxes. But what happened at the same time that we were all growing up in this beautiful, lush setting is that the evil Glasgow somehow reinvented itself as this glamorous capital of culture with all this fantastic stuff going on, and we thought, let's get out of this really boring place. We're going to Glasgow because it's really interesting now. And suddenly that problem, Glasgow the problem, became more attractive than the solution. Now, I think one of the lessons here, a few lessons to be learned from here, but I think one of the issues with new towns, new settlements, is how do you get them to evolve into the next phase? Because you build them very quickly, and they're a response to a problem we've identified at this point in time. How do you get them to evolve into the next phase? Because the people that we think we're building and planning them for don't necessarily want to stay there. I didn't stay in Cumbernauld. I left when I could. I live in London. I'm contributing to London's housing crisis now by living in London. I should have stayed in Cumbernauld. And so how do we get them to reinvent themselves? Because cities, big urban centres like Glasgow, like Manchester, like Liverpool, have this habit of reinventing themselves every so often and sometimes solving their problems, not completely, but solving a lot of their problems in quite interesting ways because they are historic cities. They are there for a reason, and they can find another reason to be there. So I think personally, if we are looking at the Garden City as a new settlement, we have to be very, very careful. The business case is very difficult to make. It's easier to make a case for taking the URBED answer to the Wolfson Prize, an existing centre, and trying to make it perform better, trying to make it bigger, to accommodate more people, because there's already a reason to be there, there's a reason to live there, there are jobs to do, there are things to do, things to take advantage of. So I would advise thinking very carefully about the Garden City concept as a solution to some of these big, big issues that we're facing right now.
Jim.